Good morning or afternoon. Today, September 6, 2022. This is SEVA VentRounds Express, meaning they are only last 30 minutes. And the topic today is targeting schemes, which we have been explaining in detail, and this is part two of the series. So here are our disclosures. Your hosts are Rob Chatburn and myself. Here are our disclosures in general, but you'll see us talk about many ventilator modes. There's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion, and it does not represent the Cleveland Clinic. Now, these are recorded sessions, so keep your microphone muted. And we may call upon members of the audience to comment as we see the chat is the best way to communicate. Just type in your feelings, your thoughts. We want to really hear what's going on through your mind about these waveforms and the learnings. And if there's questions, please, there's no question that we frown upon. We really want to be able to answer anything and talk about it. We learn a lot through each one of these. In brief, we have been reviewing over the last 4 sessions what is a mode of mechanical ventilation. And essentially, we have said that this is a predetermined pattern of interaction between the patient and the ventilator, and it has 3 items in combination: the control variable, so the breath control variable, the breath sequence, and the targeting scheme. And the combination of these 3, just to summarize it, we use what we termed a tag or taxonomic attribution group, which essentially is a summary of what is controlling the breath, the sequence, and the targeting scheme. And this is key because it helps us understand what actually the mode does. And we'll see some examples today of why this is important to know exactly what the tag is. We have reviewed that there is only 2 sides. You can only control one side of the equation, either the pressure side or the volume flow side, so either the right or the left. So if you control the volume side, it's essentially you're controlling the flow, and we call this volume control. And if you're controlling the pressure side, this is called pressure control. And essentially, you cannot control anything else. You cannot control both at the same time. And this has to do with the type of waveform that you're going to see passively. You have here a square flow and a ramp flow waveforms. And essentially what you're controlling is the flow during inspiration. And you can see here a square waveform. Even though it's a rectangle, we call it square waveform. And then a descending ramp or ramp flow waveform. Now, ventilators can alter this, and there's different settings that you can modify, but at the basic scale, these are the 2 classic flow waveforms that you're going to see. And when you're controlling pressure, classically, what the ventilator tries to do is to create a square waveform for pressure control. Although, as you will learn today, there's in modes that are controlling the pressure based on another signal. It will follow that other signal, which may be PMOS, and the pressure waveform will then look like PMOS. The second part of the sequence is the breath sequence, and what we have learned is that there's 2 types of breaths: spontaneous breaths and mandatory breaths. In the spontaneous breaths, the patient essentially triggers and cycles the breath, while in a mandatory breath, the machine triggers or cycles the breath. So it could be patient triggered, but if it's cycled by the machine, then it becomes a mandatory breath. This is just a refresher for you to remember. This is important as we start seeing this. It's common that we see people say, oh, the patient is spontaneously breathing, but every breath is mandatory because it's being cycled by the machine. And without a doubt, the patient is doing work and it's triggering. But if it's cycled by the machine, then it's called a mandatory breath. And this takes us to the 5 basic patterns of ventilation that we have described. There you will see that instead of being 6, there's 5. And the reason why there's not a 5 is a 6 is because in volume control, because you're controlling the flow, that means that you're controlling the volume that you're delivering, the size of the breath. There cannot be continuous spontaneous ventilation, meaning that the machine is controlling the cycle time if you're controlling the flow, and it's controlling the flow at the same time and the volume. So essentially that doesn't exist, and so you will only have BC-CMB, BC-IMB, PC-CMB, IMB, and CSB. These are the sequences that exist, and we reviewed this a couple of sessions before. And our last SEVA VentRounds, we reviewed what a targeting scheme. This is the last part of what describes a mode of mechanical ventilation. And the targeting scheme, in simple words, is the way that we program the ventilator to achieve the interaction with the patient. And it has to do with what you as the operator enter, the software that the ventilator uses, how it controls the hardware, and how that hardware interacts with the patient. And this feedback loop leads to all this controlling of the ventilator. And so we talked that there were several targeting schemes. So far in the literature, we have described 7 targeting schemes, and they go from very simple, where you control everything. You, the operator, set all the targets that the ventilator should achieve, all the way to really complex, in which actually the ventilator, not the operator, adjusts the targets according to artificial intelligence. And we have been going through each one of these modes of ways of targeting schemes with some examples in these SEVA VentRounds. Rob?
That's very good.
All right. So what we have been doing is putting some examples here, and we have left the name of the mode there for you to be able to read it, and rather than having to describe everything from looking at the waveforms. Although that is possible, we're going to do that. We want you to right now, if you're able to write in the chat, what is essentially the tag for this mode. So is it PC or BC? If it's CMB, IMB, or CSB? And finally, if it is, what type of targeting scheme it is. So I'll put the options here. So it's either PC or BC. Is it either CMB, CSB, IMB, or if it's set point, dual, servo, adaptive, optimal, biovariable, or intelligent. So rapidly, some answers are coming in. Have no fear. Enter your thoughts. And if you don't agree with the person that entered them, that's okay. All right, Rob. It seems that so far they have entered PC, CMB, A. Can you walk us through that, Rob? What do you think about that?
That's correct. There's 2 ways of knowing it's correct. One is just to look up PRVC on a chart, and we have tables that have those. We have handout cards, and we also have the ventilator mode map app that works on your phone. So those are one ways to do it. But if you want to derive it from the waveforms, the first thing you want to do is look at the flow waveform, and we see it does not have a square or triangular shape. It has an exponential decay shape, so that clues us that it's pressure control. We look up at the pressure waveform and we see, yes, indeed, we have essentially a constant inspiratory pressure target. So this is pressure control ventilation. On this ventilator, we would see a patient trigger as a white portion of either the pressure waveform for pressure triggering or the flow waveform for flow triggering. We don't see either one of those, except maybe the first one. So this would indicate that the ventilator is triggering. So that alone is enough to tell us that these are all mandatory breaths. But furthermore, we can see that the inspiratory time is very consistent, hasn't changed a bit. So we can probably infer that it's also time cycled. So again, these are all mandatory breaths. So we have pressure control, continuous mandatory ventilation. So what about the targeting scheme? Well, we notice that there is a difference in the pressure targets. The pressure targets are going up, and as a result, the tidal volumes are going up. Furthermore, if we look down at the controls, we see that even though this is pressure control mode, there is a tidal volume setting. Now, again, we are only setting tidal volume and not flow, so that means this isn't volume control. It's pressure control with a volume target, sometimes called volume guarantee loosely. But this indicates that the ventilator is told that you're going to control pressure during the breath, but you're going to adjust it as for example, as the compliance gets worse, by increasing the inspiratory pressure until you get that tidal volume of 400 on average. So that's an example of what we're seeing here is adaptive targeting scheme in the face of a rapidly decreasing, or just in the face of a decreased compliance over these breaths, and the ventilator is trying to adjust inspiratory pressure to give us that target. So it's pressure control, continuous mandatory ventilation with adaptive targeting.
Thank you, Rob. And one way that whenever I read the titles of the modes of mechanical ventilation, it helps me realize how important it is to have a tag. But it also may help you as a crutch to remember this. So PRVC stands for pressure regulated. So essentially the machine is regulating the pressure during the breath. So pressure control is telling you that. But then it says volume control. So it says pressure regulated volume control. You're not controlling the volume. In reality, if I wanted this to be a little bit more accurate, I would call it PRVT. So pressure regulated volume targeted. And it may have actually be a little bit more akin to what the ventilator is doing rather than saying that it's volume control. But this is one of the classic myths and fallacies that go out in mechanical ventilation, thinking that these are volume control modes. Rob?
Yeah, in fact, I would even go so far as to say, if I was the engineer, I would say it's pressure control volume targeted.
Yep.
And also other manufacturers call it even worse things like volume control plus.
Yes.
Well, it's not volume control, it's pressure control plus, if you will.
And we have some gifts of that nature in the future here. We'll see. All right. Excellent questions. I don't see any on the chat. If you have questions, either you can unmute yourself or write it in the chat. I'm monitoring it consistently with Rob. All righty. So here's another one. Again, we want you just to tell us the tag. And the tag for this would be the mode is on the top of the screen. Sorry, right there. So what is the tag for this mode? And you can use the tag, the Rosetta Stone, the Vent Mode app. Very good. I see some entries coming in. Okay. So far I have a couple of entries. I presume the rest support the mission. So it has been entered that this is pressure control CSVR. And so let's go in order. So pressure control. Remember that the ventilators are mediocre pressure controllers. They're very good at flow control. And so when you come and look at your flow, you don't see a geometric waveform, or actually you don't even see them to be identical. Each one of these waveforms is a little bit different amongst each other, which tells you that this is likely that the pressure is being controlled and not the flow. And so Without a doubt, this is what is being controlled is the pressure, meaning during inspiration, the ventilator is controlling the pressure. Then, for the sake of today, we're going to say that this is CSV. And what that CSV means is that all the breaths are spontaneously triggered, patient triggered and patient cycled. Okay. And you heard Rob actually eloquently say, Eduardo, every single one in this ventilator, when it's a patient triggered, the machine identifies that it's the patient triggering, it will change color. And actually you can see all these breaths, and until you get to this one, you see the changing color. You see the white breath being triggered there by a changing color. And on the bottom of the screen, you see this pink waveform, and the pink waveform actually has those white lines in change. So let's just describe a little bit what we're seeing on the screen. On the top panel, you have pressure, like we do on every other ventilator. Then you have flow, then you have volume, and then on the bottom of it, you see this EDI waveform with microvolts being displayed. And EDI means the electrical signal of the diaphragm. And the marvel of NAVA is that it essentially simplified the signal of the diaphragm obtained by a catheter in the esophagus to this very nice looking line. Normally, it looks something like that, very noisy. And what they were able to do was to simplify this, to essentially clean it and give you a waveform that manifested the amount of electrical voltage that the diaphragm was generating, in a sense. And so what you see here is that every breath is actually being triggered by, in this case, the diaphragm signal. So you see the color, the white color is at the beginning of this signal, except this breath where the signal, even though we have an electrical signal, it occurred that the change in pressure occurred first, and it actually generated a pressure trigger. So the machine has an algorithm, and it chooses either or of the signals, whatever occurs first, and gives you the breath. And if not, please correct me, Rob, but I believe that's the algorithm.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Okay. And then, so that's what's triggering. And then what's cycling the breath, at least in NAVA, in this iteration of NAVA, the breath is cycled when the EDI, the signal, the electrical signal of the diaphragm drops to 70% of the peak. So 70% of the peak is where the breath is cycled off. And so essentially it's cycled by the diaphragm. When the activity of the patient goes down, the breath is ended. So what you will see is that this is using what we call a targeting scheme, which is servo, which essentially means that it's proportional. Proportional to what? So the pressure, because it's what we're controlling, is proportional to the electrical activity of the diaphragm. And so this is being measured by the catheter in the esophagus, and then it's multiplied by this number over here, which we call the NAVA level. And according to that level of millivolt multiplied by this level of NAVA level will give you the amount of pressure that the patient is getting. And so essentially you can see the waveform over here and over here. They are very similar because they're matching. This is the pressure delivered by the ventilator is being guided by the diaphragm. And so if you notice breath number 1 and breath number 4, you can see one has a bigger peak, and you can see as the patient did more effort, the patient got even more pressure from the ventilator. So that's why it's called proportional. And in this case, in this iteration of the type of targeting scheme, what it's using is the electrical signal from the diaphragm. Rob?
Yes, Ari submitted this, and he and I both think that the reason that the fifth breath there was pressure triggered was possibly because the patient was using accessory muscles. You can see that he's making a big effort on inspiration because there's a high sort of a billowed upflow, and he's making expiratory efforts. So it's not unreasonable to suspect that an accessory muscle could have dropped the pressure before the diaphragm signal kicked in.
Yeah. Very good. Questions regarding the targeting? Any other comments regarding the targeting scheme, Rob?
Nothing else has come through, nope.
Alrighty, so that's what PCCSBR, and you'll see that there's other iterations. Actually, they have been changing the software for NAVA, and it doesn't behave exactly the same as it used to behave before, but that's for another discussion. Right now, we're just focusing on the targeting scheme. Alrighty. Here's another one. So what is the tag for this mode over here? So remember, volume control or pressure control, CMB, IMB, or CSB, and then the targeting scheme. And this will take us actually to talk a little bit about the 4 different types of IMB. Have no fear, type away. Good, Sairam, that's a good start. Good. A good amount of input from the team, really good. So there's different readouts over here. So this is a good one to discuss. So to start, you can see that the way that this ventilator got written, this is the name of the mode. So they said it's SIMB PRVC plus PS. The first thing that you would see, actually, Rob, do you want to read this one? That's I can read it.
Okay, I can do it. It's complicated, but again, if we look at just the name PRVC, we know that it's probably going to be involving adaptive targeting because we talked about that before. But if we just start from scratch here, again, we look at the flow waveform. We see that this is an exponential decay during inspiration. That is indicative of pressure control. And indeed, on all of these breaths, it looks like there's a constant pressure target that the ventilator is trying to control to. So that's pressure control. Okay, so now, are these mandatory or spontaneous breaths or both? Well, what we see is we have some relatively large breaths that are, these are those ones that you're pointing at. They're either machine triggered or the patient triggered, but they have the same inspiratory time, so they are time cycled. So these big breaths are mandatory breaths. And in between them, we see some little guys. They are patient triggered. They're smaller, and it's not easy to tell, but the only way this pattern can occur is if these were pressure support breaths. And pressure support is a flow cycled, which is patient cycling. So they're patient triggered, patient cycled. That makes them, by definition, spontaneous breaths. So what we see here is the first breath we see on to the left is a spontaneous breath because it's a little guy. Then we get a big one that is machine triggered. That's a mandatory breath. Then we have a patient triggered mandatory breath, a couple small spontaneous breaths, and so on. We are seeing that the mandatory breath, the second mandatory breath is smaller than the third and the fourth and the fifth mandatory breath. And that indicates that the ventilator is adjusting the inspiratory pressure target according to the adaptive targeting scheme, which again is what PRVC means. So that only leaves us with this idea of more than one kind of IMV, right? So originally, IMV, or sometimes called SIMV, was a mode where you can set the frequency of mandatory breaths, and then spontaneous breaths could occur at any rate they wanted in between, and the two did not interact. Later on, manufacturers realize that mandatory breaths are not that comfortable because you set the inspiratory time and might not match what the patient's neural inspiratory time is. So they said, well, if there are spontaneous breaths like we see here, let's just let those suppress the mandatory breaths. And that's called Imv Type 2. And that's you'll see that in modes like auto mode or spontaneous timed in BiPAP machines and things like that. Then there's a Type 3 where if the spontaneous minute ventilation is higher than the set mandatory minute ventilation, then again, the mandatory breaths will be suppressed. And there's a fourth kind where if the patient makes a large enough inspiratory effort, they can actually change a mandatory volume control breath into a spontaneous pressure control breath. So there are 4 different ways that we can have IMV, or patterns of spontaneous and mandatory breaths. 3 of those ways allow spontaneous breaths to suppress the mandatory breaths in the interest of promoting the goal of comfort or improving synchrony.
Excellent, Rob. And I would just highlight here the key. This is one of those modes that now you're starting to think, well, when would I use this, right? What type of patient would I want mandatory breaths that are adaptive, and then let the patient breathe spontaneously in between at a different rate? How would I set my SIMB? Where do I set my tidal volume rate for them? But it's relatively hard to make that assessment just by looking at the title of the mode, and that's the benefit of using the tag of now knowing that it's pressure control IMB. The breaths are it's a classic IMB, meaning the breaths are gonna happen every single time at the set rate, and that it's gonna follow an adaptive targeting for the mandatory breath and a set point targeting for the spontaneous breaths. And as you get out into the community and back into your practice or into another academic centers, you're gonna need to know this about each one of the modes that you use.
Yeah, and just to say, just real quick,
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to complicate things because we're running out of time, but go ahead, go on to the next one.
So let's do this one over here. This is another type of mode in which this is called auto mode, PCPS CPAP. And here's a tracing of that poor human being on this mode. So let's hear your thoughts there. What do you think is the tag for this patient? I'm gonna get a T-shirt with that, Sairam. I love it. I don't know, but lots of PMOS.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, PCIMB, what the hell is happening here? So this is great. So you all recognized so far the presence of PC and rapidly also the thought that this has mandatory breaths, and there's very nice clues here. So we know this is pressure controlled, but because the flow is not being controlled, there's no control in any of these settings. So therefore, and with the name, it also is a nice, beautiful key that this is that we're controlling the pressure. And then it's IMB, and I'll point out the mandatory breaths. This breath is machine triggered, and it's actually machine cycled. And you know that because the flow went to 0 at the end of the breath, which means that this has to be machine cycled, meaning by time. And this breath are the same. So there's 2 mandatory breaths here. And then you have a patient triggered breath, 2 patient triggered breaths, and these are larger than the other 2 that are here. And and so these are, because they are different in size, these are essentially patient cycle 2. So it's an IMB type. These are patient or spontaneous breaths, spontaneous breaths. So because you have 2 types of breaths occurring in the sequence, that's PCIMB. Now in the auto mode type, is the type of IMV that it takes is type 2, meaning that spontaneous breaths will suppress the mandatory breaths when they reach a certain threshold. So if you have, and different algorithms may have different ways of implementing it. It may be the average of a number of seconds before the last breath, or it may be within a minute or whatnot, but it will suppress the mandatory breaths out. So here you still see the two types, but if the patient continues to breathe at a higher rate than the algorithm wants, you will only see spontaneous breaths occurring. So this is type 2. And you could have very low minute ventilation or very high respiratory rate. The mandatory breaths are not going to appear as long as you are above the frequency. And then because this is telling you it's auto mode PCPS, what it does is it changes from pressure control to pressure support, so meaning both of them are set points. So you would set in the settings for this the inspiratory pressure for the mandatory breaths and the inspiratory pressure for the spontaneous breaths, and you would set the I time for the mandatory breaths too. So you essentially set what you want, but the beauty about this mode, in a sense, or the technology behind it, is that whenever the patient is breathing on its own, the amount of support, the patient will get spontaneous breaths. So essentially eliminating issues with cycle synchrony on this group of patients. It goes away because of that. So this is the last mode that we'll see today, the PC-IMV type 2 SS. And there's more targeting schemes. We can spend the whole year actually just discussing targeting schemes and how they're implemented. But in general, what we wanted you to come out from these SEVA Express rounds is knowing how to use the tag, what does each one of the members of the tag mean, and how to use it, so that when you use the Vent Mode app, or you use the Rosetta card or mode card that we have available, you can understand where are we going, what are we using. Again, these are our emails and our Twitter handles. Send us questions, images, and we'll put them here. This was the end of the basic tag use. Now we're going to start, starting next week, we're going to start going into the modes and starting to read them a little bit more. We're going to go into load and how to interpret the physiology from the waveforms. All right. In 2 weeks, that's correct, Hara. Appreciate it. All righty. Have a great day. See you in G61. Have a good one. 60, sorry, G60.